And what that enabled us to do, and some people called us crazy at the time, but what that enabled us to do is to really get a chronology of time of how that material was accumulating and what its composition was. And because we had such an integrated group of people, we were able to do chronology, we were able to date the sediments, we were able to do sort of sedimentology, some basic geologic work. Organic geochemistry we could do, looking at the oil components as well as other biological components. Patrick Schwing was doing work on benthic foraminifera, understanding how they were impacted by the transport of oil to the sedimentary system. We were doing work in microbial ecology, looking at bacteria, but also if there was surface material that was really readily apparent, such as photoautotrophic communities, primary producers, were they being transported to the sedimentary system? We were looking at redox changes, other chemical changes like C14, which is a lot of the work that Brad is doing, Brad Rosenheim. And so really, when you started to look at this at that high resolution, this was really a perfect job for a forensic marine molecular organic geochemist. And you could really coin the term as a CSI. We were doing forensic geochemistry, trying to understand the pre-blowout event, the event itself, and then how the system recovered after the event. And so when you took sediments in the northern Gulf of Mexico, right after the blowout, you noticed some things really striking. First of all, you notice that if you just look at these are very coherent, very homogeneous type sediments, and they're bioturbated. There's a lot of oxygen on the bottom of the seafloor, and as a result, the organisms can bioturbate and mix the system. But you can see in the upper sequence that bioturbation doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, you can draw lines straight across the sediment interface. It's associated with redox chemistry, changes in the oxygen, but that's associated with the fact that these bioturbation was not actually occurring, and that there was excess carbon coming down to the sedimentary system, driving changes, severe changes in redox. And the question is, what's inside those sediments? And this was not an area, very small area, this was a large region. And the question then is, here we see approximately 3 centimeters of accumulation, which was occurring essentially instantaneously. Is that the kind of sedimentation rate that we're normally seeing, or is that a really enhanced sedimentation rate, like a flocculent event? So our colleagues at Eckerd College, as well as Schwing, was doing work in thorium isotope decay. Thorium has a very, very short half-life, about 22 days. So it's an ideal half-life to try to calculate sedimentation rates that are on the order of months. Lead-210 has a half-life of about 21, 22 years, which is really ideal for looking at integrated sedimentation rates over decades to hundreds of years, to about 100 years. And what we were able to recognize is that the accumulation rates in lead-210 world were sitting at about 0.1 gram per centimeter squared per year. But then directly after the event, 2010, the sedimentation rates, the accumulation rates of material went up dramatically, like a depositional event. And then since that time, has gradually decreased to present. And that was also confounding for us, because this was an event, if you remember, it was released for about 87 days, and then it was cleared up. But what we continued to see as we took cores in 2010, 11, 12, and 13, and through to today, 14, there's this gradual relaxation from this high sedimentation rate, high accumulation rate, to today. Again, I'll come back to that, but it's a really important feature. If you do some basic work like sediment grain size, what you recognize if you look at different cores, whether it be at 1,100 meters, 1,000 meters, or even if you look shallower at 600, 400, and 100, each one of them in the pre-blowout time had a unique distribution of different grain sizes. But during the event and the year following, all of those sites coalesced to the same small grain sizes. So something ubiquitous to the entire Gulf of Mexico was happening. Prior to the event, they all had unique distributions. Directly after the event and for the years following, they all had the same grain size. Something physical, sedimentological was happening in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Work from Isabel Romero recognized using the accumulation rates and then looking at molecular approaches. You could see that the organic carbon accumulation rate during the Deepwater Horizon event relative to background times increased by 20, 30-fold. But if you looked at the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the toxic compounds, they increased by hundreds to 300-fold what the background concentration or background accumulation rate was. And you can take those PAHs and break them into purely petrogenic of petroleum origin, or you can look at the modified components that are associated with the burning, such as pyrogenic PAHs. And for both of them, you can see they increase by hundreds up to 200-fold the accumulation rate of what the background contribution of the PAHs are. So this was a significant event sedimentologically that was packed with contaminant chemicals. Work from Patrick Schwing still looks at forams, at the distribution, the concentration, and the accumulation of these benthic foraminifera. In blue is 2010, and in purple is 2011, and we'll just look at this component here. And what you see is something quite interesting, is that the relative these forams, these really indicator species that live in the sediments, essentially showed a massive decline spatially, regionally throughout the entire northern Gulf of Mexico. And in 2011, you had some sites that actually recovered. Not necessarily with the same community, but to recover. But other sites continued to decline. So really the habitat, the condition of the benthic ecosystem was really jeopardized. And the question then is, how does that contaminant chemistry and those seminal species in the benthic system give you an indicator of how ultimately it could affect upper trophic level stuff, which I'm sure Steve will talk about in the next while. So we can relate these changes to contaminant components, to the changes in redox that we see, and we can really tie together why there was a benthic decline, a decline in the benthic abundance of organisms associated with the contaminant input, and as a result, changes also in the redox condition. And this was not limited to the northeast Gulf of Mexico. This is essentially at the wellhead. This is about 120 kilometers away from the wellhead to the south and west. So here you see that redox layer not at 3 centimeters, but at 10 centimeters. 10 centimeters of material, where normally in the northern Gulf of Mexico, you're accumulating 1 millimeter per year. And here you're talking about redox changes that it can extend down to 10 centimeters, 100 millimeters. To the south and west, upwards of 50 millimeters or 5 centimeters. Those are really dramatic changes in the depositional system and the consequence for the biological system. Other work by Isabel Romero was sort of comparing the surface expression of the oil to the sedimentary expression of the oil. And what she was able to recognize, and this is a database from NOAA, where it had over 500 different sites, is that there was a spatial and temporal offset between the surface oil expression and the sedimentary oil expression. And this was occurring in all different compound classes. So this is really another question of how come you had such spatial and temporal offset between the surface oil and the bottom oil? And the answer is, of course, you had continuous transport across the continental shelf. Once it was deposited as a flocculent material, it would just be transported away and down onto the continental slope environment. And so again, somewhere on the order of 10% plus or minus of the oil was accumulating into the sedimentary system. And so in addition to those primary mechanisms of the toxic bathtub ring and the flocculent blizzard, we also had to have cross-shelf transport, which also has to be accommodated. So That was 2012, 2014, and recently, in November of 14, well, I should say in June of 2014, we submitted a second round of funding through the GOMRI, and in November, we heard that we were awarded $20.2 million for research spanning 2015 now to 2017. And this was the largest non-medical grant in the history of USF. And we did a little play on a Wordle that sort of shows what we're up to in the second phase of the research. And most of these words you guys can understand, but there might be one word you are not familiar with, and that's XDoc. Does anybody know what XDoc is? So XDoc was the actual first submarine blowout. It occurred in 1979. And in geology, there's a great idiom. That is that the present is the key to the past, but the past provides a window to see into the future. So the present, being the Deepwater Horizon, is now going through its process. But the XDoc, which occurred back in 1979, also was a blowout. So certainly different kind of conditions. But understanding the XDoc system, which is in the Bay of Campeche in the southern Gulf of Mexico, can give us a vision for how we can predict what will happen to the northern Gulf of Mexico 30 years into the future. So the BP oil spill occurred in 2010. The XDoc occurred in shallower waters, ran not for 87 days, but ran for 9, almost 10 months long. And so this is an analog system that can be used to kind of interpret the range of end-member environmental conditions that occur when such an environmental disaster occurs. And just to finish up, our colleagues in Mexico have been taking cores and measuring PAHs, and what one sees here is a sedimentary system that has an event in the midst of it. And this is the XDoc event back in 1979. And consequently, there's sedimentation that has occurred for the 40 years since. So these are really significant events in the sedimentary system, which has significant biological consequences, not only for forams, but also for fish and upper trophic levels. And so we'll be investigating these. And the question is, are these kind of one-offs, or is this something that's going to happen as we look forward? Well, deep water drilling is really here to stay. And the engineering, although they can do it, it's on the edge of their capacity. This is a graph of the age of the wells, and as you go to more recent times, you're seeing the drilling going deeper and deeper and deeper. And the question is, and you can see it relative to time, the shallow water, deep, and ultra deep drilling is increasing as you move to more present day. And the question is, why would that be? Well, if you look at the amount of oil in the reservoirs, the deeper reservoirs have significantly more oil. And so, okay, at $40 a barrel today, that's going to be iffy. But if you ultimately, which will happen, the demand is high, the cheap oil will disappear, and then they're going to start drilling away in deeper and deeper environments. So understanding the consequences of these marine blowouts is really quite important to the industry. In the past, the industry responded to where money comes in, which is through exploration and production. They rarely considered the aspects associated with spilled oil or problems. But now, when you have such an event, and it can cost you as an industry $40 billion, $100 billion, that has to be then now evaluated in the consequence of ultimately your profit margin. So the oil companies are extremely interested in understanding the impacts, the consequences of these kind of events. And of course, environmentally, as we know, the drilling is going to continue. And I think as a society, it's important that we know this. So that's it for me. I'll pass on, even on questions. If anybody wants to come and speak to us, we're all around in the Paleo Lab. come by anytime.